Hello friends, Jennifer Pearson here, Thistle Gypsy, with my last suit for the Sacred Sites Tarot. So I've been going through the Sacred Sites Tarot, investigating the various sites, trying to connect them to the card they've been assigned to, with varying success. And so this is the final suit, but it's not my final time with this deck. Because this is my deck for December. So I will return to this deck in December and have it for the deck of the month. So then I'll see how usable it is for readings for me, if the association with certain sites kind of disrupts my ability to read it. Like, you know, if I look at this and I try to is that supposed to be, see, already I'm like, is that Milarepa? I can't remember. But anyway, to think too much about the site instead of just the card association. For the most part, the sites have had an understandable relationship to the card they've been assigned to, the traditional card they've been assigned to. But I always feel with decks like this, they, you know, whatever's on the card adds kind of a nuance of interpretation. But at the same time, if I then find myself getting fixated on what, you know, sort of meaning that additional relationship might add to the card, it can be disruptive to the reading. So we'll just have to see in December. For now, I'm just trying to find out about the sites because some of them were not familiar to me. And some of them were familiar, but it doesn't hurt to find out, you know, only passing familiarity. And so didn't hurt to find out more about it. And I got some updates on the Bermuda Triangle, which is in the Suit of Swords, which is what we're looking at today. Various other things. So it was really interesting. There are what I felt were some misrepresentations in this deck. There are some of those in, you know, some of the other suits, but I felt like it was particularly egregious in some of the cards in this suit. But let's go on. So they've kind of gone out of their way to associate some pointy things here with this card, which is the Ace of Swords. With this trident, I don't know what that association is. If you know, if you're from this, if you know about this, this is Mount Everest. So if you know what this trident might represent, feel free to leave that information in the comments. I didn't particularly come across that. In the guidebook, it says Sagarmatha, Sagarmatha, is the local name for Mount Everest. This is the part of the Himalayas and the highest mountain peak of the earth. Some of its many names include Mother of the Universe in Tibetan and God of the Heavens in Nepali. So what did I have written for that? It means, with the Sagar means sky and Matha means head. So it means like sky head or goddess of the sky. I got it from what I looked up. It was not God, but goddess. So closer to the mother of the universe or mother of the world. And I found out that that area of the Himalayas, or maybe it's the Himalayas in general, is what was called the world's greatest orogenic belt. And orogeny is the building of mountains on continents via uplift. So it makes sense for the Ace of Swords, certainly. I didn't have a problem with that. I assume that this is like glacial stuff, it looks like. So glacial formations there that this person is standing among, and maybe, again, that's supposed to be sword-ish. So here we have a very different scene. This is Ryoan-ji, Ryoan-ji, temple at Kyoto. And so this is the famous rock garden. The Temple of Kyoto in Japan is home to the most famous Zen garden. The arrangement of its elements encourages visitors to meditate. So, you know, Two of Swords is traditionally a card of sitting and trying to decide between two things, having a dilemma. So meditation is not about deciding, but I can see where they get this. It was described in one of the videos that I saw, or maybe I had to also look it up. Some of these I had to look up on Wikipedia as well. There was something about looking into the essence of something. And of course, when you have that Two of Swords and you've got that dilemma and you're trying to decide between two things that seem to be the same, you want to look into the essence of it. So that makes sense to me. You know, there's something about the Two of Swords that is also reductionist. You know, you're reducing things down to, they're down to two, and the assumption is that you want it down to one. And that's appropriate to this site because, you know, you're eliminating almost everything but a few rocks. And yeah, so it's reductionist in that regard and makes you focus really strongly on what is actually there. All right, next. The Three of Swords. I'm not sure I totally got this for the Three of Swords. Well, I'll look at it here in a second. But what it is Tunguska in Siberia. So in 1908, there was a tremendous explosion that knocked down 60 million trees. Even today, there is still no convincing explanation for this mysterious event. Oh, I think that there were some kind of convincing explanations, but I'm not going to go into all of that. So I was trying to figure out how it related to the Three of Swords, and I was thinking like a singular. So you have the two swords, and then you have one in a traditional image. You have two swords in the heart, and then you have one coming down between them. And so I was thinking maybe it's that one singular thing that destroys something. The sword that broke the heart's back, that kind of thing. But it remained a little mysterious as an association with this. You know, so this is the Sacred Sites Tarot. Another issue here is that this is not a sacred site. Nobody's worshiping it. But some of these sites in this particular suit, and there are some in others as well, that that where I was like, well, that isn't a sacred site, but it is a site of fascination. So, and this is a suit of swords is the mind. It's a site of intense scientific fascination. So I see how it's got here into the suit of swords. Um, Another thing I I was trying to, in an attempt to grasp why it's the Three of Swords, um, is that it's something from the air, the suit of air, that shook the earth to its core, shook the earth, felt like as far away as, I don't know if it was the impact that was felt as far away as London, um, but there was a glow that, yeah, okay, it was the glow, not the, I don't think it was the impact. But it was, so I interpreted this way, a tragedy that enlightened a large portion of the northern hemisphere, because it did create light somehow. I think they were saying it had something to do with dust particles in the atmosphere, and that was the thing that was noticed as far away as London. Like people could read their newspaper, I think is what they were saying, um, in the middle of the night or something, due to the glow that resulted from this. I've either got allergies going on tonight or I'm coming down with a cold. And so my nose is giving me trouble. And just kind of starting this, it was kind of doing it, and then, but after starting this video, it's like, oh dear, it's getting a little intense, which to me means it's more likely to be a cold. Oh, but I think we'll make it through the video. But I might have some pauses to address the issue with my nose here. So that's the most I can make out of the Three of Swords. So the Four of Swords, this annoys me a little bit, this representation, because it's fanciful. It's how can I say? It's depicting the legend and not what's truly there, which is more appropriate for the Four of Swords. So this is the, they're calling it the sepulcher of Charlemagne. Many legends narrate that Charlemagne is not dead but awaits petrified, and will be awakened, and will, oh, there's an error here, will be awakened from his slumber on the day of the last judgment. Be that as it may, so there's where he is buried, in the place that he created for himself to be buried, is a wonderful tower full of stained glass. So it relates to the Four of Swords in that his remains, his current remains, or at least part of them, are in like a golden casket, that is surrounded by a tower of stained glass. It's really quite beautiful. It's Aachen, so double Achen in Germany. Aachen, do they call it Aachen Cathedral? I can't remember. And the chapel was built upon the idea of fours equaling perfection. It's an octagon inside a 16-sided ring. So the whole thing is built on multiples of 4. 4 times 2 and 4 times 4. It also has a healing hot springs, the city, not the temple. I don't think the temple does. No, I can't remember. But the city itself, supposedly Charlemagne suffered from arthritis, I think they said. And so this particular location appealed to him because there was also the hot springs that were considered healing. And he was also, it's normally shown with, it's normally a warrior that is shown. And Charlemagne was a warrior, and he considered himself a warrior for God. So, a religious, he felt a sense of religious mission. All right. So this one makes sense, except for it bothers me, I guess, because it would make perfect sense if they had included the stained glass, but maybe they didn't want to go to that. Maybe they wanted to keep it more mysterious. There is a legend. Okay, so this makes sense with everything that I just told you, but not so much to me from the image that's here. So there was a legend that that some religious person in charge of this cathedral or church found the remains of Charlemagne underneath, like buried underneath the church, and he was seated like this, as opposed to being in a reclining position. But nobody could ever prove that. So, and supposedly the bones were put in the golden casket, so whatever. There is myth kind of associated with it. It is believed that the bones, at this point, that the bones in the golden casket are those of Charlemagne. And there are some of his bones actually displayed as reliquaries in there. So the next one, the Five of Swords. I'm not sure I ever reconciled like why this is the Five of Swords, but and the site itself looks nothing like this. It looks nothing like this. Yeah. So it's Cruachan. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. The Cave of Cruachan, which is, was it in Ireland? No, I can't remember. Yes, it must have been. Yep, it says right here, Irish mythology. Cruachan is the ancient capital, so there's maybe mythology here that I did not encounter. Because I didn't do like a Wikipedia. I didn't go there. I was just looking on YouTube. So it's the Cave of Cruachan, Cruachan, and I'm spelling it essentially so that people, if you want to look it up further, you can do that. It says Cruachan is the ancient capital of the kingdom of Connacht, Connacht in Irish mythology. This cave, also called the Gateway to Hell, was considered the entrance to the underworld. Now, what I was finding as an association to it was the Morrigan's cave. So that description sounds very mythological, but there is an actual location, a cave called the Morrigan's cave. if I recall correctly, it's like on private property or something. And there's not much to it. Part of it has collapsed, but you can go down into it. It's very narrow. It struck me as sort of like, there's a lot of cave worshiping within this deck and within our prehistory. But this one struck me as being very like a birth canal. As people, there's a couple of videos of people going down into it, and the opening to it is nearly covered with foliage, so it's not super obvious, and it's triangular. It's very, it could be associated with a woman's genital area easily. But it was supposed to be Queen Maeve's cave, and an entrance to the underworld, but not necessarily a Christian type of underworld, but to connect to the underworld. And you can only go so far because I think they said putting up a utility pole or something at one point caused the cave to collapse, and so it's no longer goes back as far as it did. I think at one point it went back to a chamber, but just a small chamber. And there's not too much else to be said about that. Why? Maybe it's the utility pole. I'm thinking, why is it the Five of Swords? Well, the Five of Swords is kind of like going too far and kind of destroying something. So maybe that's what it is. It's the utility pole going into the ground and causing the cave to collapse. So maybe that's what it is. I don't think that occurred to me at the time. It's just talking about it now. So, yep. To me, there's nothing else to say about that. That's one that will be a little difficult to make an association with. I mean, I don't think I would ever use this deck really to read for other people, but if I did, I'd be stuck, because to me, you want something on the card that you can, that you can show to somebody and say, this is why I'm interpreting this way. And that doesn't come across here. Now, there could be some legend associated with this cave and what happened there that I'm not keying into or straight out don't know. Without all of these birds exiting the cave, there was, like on more than one occasion, where whomever, the Morrigan, went into the cave or drew from the cave. I don't remember that it was white birds. These to me look like seagulls or something, but would draw something from the cave, like in mass. And again, maybe that's another indication of overdoing things. So yeah, again, if you are more informed about these sorts of things, feel free to leave information or a link down in the comments that might enlighten where I remain confused. All right, so the Six of Swords. Again, there was a struggle on my part to get why it was the Six of Swords, but I eventually got there. At least I think I did, in a couple of different ways. This is the Dogon village in Mali. This is an African population of Mali. They possess unexplained astronomic knowledge to the point that it was believed that they had been in contact with extraterrestrial civilizations in the past. Hard to say. I mean, there are people who are fascinated with that story. this idea. There are people who say it's quite possible that they got the specific information from encounters with Westerners at one point, and that they have a very good oral tradition, and they learned what what the people said, and have and retained it and passed it down because it was information about a star that they consider very significant in their mythology. I don't know. But that, I think, has created a fascination with this culture that's a bit overboard. In my, I will admit to my own bias. I really don't have a problem. I do admire, again, that they seem to have some really interesting traditions and thoughts, so I think they're interesting, but it was clear even before I found out that they're into female genital circumcision, clitoral circumcision, is part of their practice, that they were a very male-oriented culture, which of course is no surprise around the world. So you could say that I am less likely to be awestruck and fascinated when I discover some of their attitudes toward women. But by the same token, I feel like they're doing an interesting job of dealing with maleness, and they do have an interesting idea that everybody is born being both male and female, but for some reason they feel like in the process of maturity that needs to be divided again. So the female aspect needs to be removed from the male, and the male aspect needs to be removed from the female. But and that so they associate circumcision with the removal of the female from the male, but clitoral removal as being the removal of the male from the female, which are not equivalent things, let alone it just, anyway, there are problems there. And I don't know if anybody has ever read about female genital mutilation. It goes beyond what I just said and can be pretty gruesome. So back to the way it relates to the Six of Swords, because those things are not very Six of Swords-ish. They're more Five of Swords, Five of Swords-ish. So there is a myth. Part of their origination myth includes the idea of a pair of twins who migrate to the star Sirius and then return to the Earth. So to me, that's also a Six of Swords type of thing. To me, the Six of Swords is somebody who has encountered conflict in the outer world, and they are crossing those calmer waters. Usually there's a little island in the distance. I often see it as a woman who, for some reason or another, has been engaged in a bad marriage, a bad partnership of some kind, and is having to retreat for her own and her child's safety back home to people who properly care about her. So there is this notion of return in part of their origination story. However, in more modern day Well, not even modern day, actually, because, the Muslims have made inroads in that area for centuries, I believe. Again, anybody who has a better grounding in information about this, feel free to leave it in the comments. But they are known for resisting conversion to Islam, and doing so by retreating into a more remote area where they have less exposure to Islam, and Islam had difficulty getting to them. So there is that aspect also of retreat and of kind of sanctuary. So there is the Dogon village. And the Six of Swords, on to the Seven of Swords. This is another one that annoys me. So I can no longer remember when the Pirates of the Caribbean came out. But this strikes me as very Pirates of the Caribbean, with, the dead people underneath and the galleon here. I'm not even sure what this glowing thing is over on the side. Maybe it's more spirits. Glowing thing. Well, I guess it's lightning coming down. And then, I don't know, turning into plasma or something. I don't know. But the Bermuda Triangle, which this is representing, from, again, the documentaries I was looking at, is not from this time period. It was not noted as having issues from this time period. It's all about more present day. In particular, some airplanes, some military planes that disappeared, utterly disappeared. But there seems to be an understanding in part about what might have happened. And one of the documentaries that I watched retraced the route of these airmen, and both planes. So there was the plane that was the theater part of the documentary. We're watching these people, retracing the steps of the airmen. And then there was the film crew on another plane that was filming the plane that was the theater, of what was going on, what we were seeing as people watching the film. And both of those planes encountered compass interference at, I think, 2 key points, at least 1 key point on the journey. There was interference with them. They weren't reading right. And it was also noted that with improvements like satellite assistance, there have been far fewer incidents. But there are still some strange incidents, but far fewer like disappearances going on, critical incidents where people disappear going on within the triangle. But again, it's not, none of it, from my understanding, is from this period of history. It's all more recent. And I can't remember if it's all during the 1900s or if there was anything earlier than that. I don't remember if there was anything even earlier than the Airmen, but yeah, it's not coming back to me. Again, feel free to correct me down in the comments. Provide a link for more information. So how does it relate to the Seven of Swords, which is generally associated with theft and or deception, intentional theft or deception. And so the theft, I think, is the whole idea of alien abduction kind of a thing, like they're going unwillingly into a portal and they're sucked up, so it's that theory, I think. The whole idea of some kind of electromagnetic interference, I suppose you could, again, traditionally Rider-Waite-Smith, it's actual theft of something. But if instead of theft you think of it as interference, then you could think of the electromagnetic interference as, having to do with this. But of course, with this ship on here, that doesn't make any sense at all. Because that isn't what they would have been using well, I suppose they may have had they may have had a compass that was being used in that way, but I think if this area that you would have a sextant that is more aligned with the stars and not with, a needle that's tracking electromagnetic forces on the earth. I could be wrong. Again, feel free to correct me. But so I don't know. We do have dark skies here, like a storm is coming, and the storm could be interfering. So I would have to, again, let go of the idea of theft or something like that and just think in terms maybe of interference that results actually in tragedy. So to me, the meaning of this card is changed a lot by this association with the Bermuda Triangle, unless we really lean on the whole, abducted by aliens kind of a thing, which wouldn't be my go-to interpretation, but we can do it. So I'm just going to let that be. I feel a little bit inconclusive about that. So here we are at the Eight of Swords now, the Oracle of Delphi, which was interesting to listen to the documentaries on this one. The science that has arisen around the Oracle of Delphi is really interesting. So in the guidebook it says, also called the Navel of the World, this sanctuary where Pythia prophesied was home to the most important oracle in the world of ancient Greece. Okay, very true. Here they're kind of dramatizing what she's doing. I mean, there wasn't any wind down there. I don't know what's happening to her hair. She's wearing this really skimpy stuff, and there's supposed to be versions. So, well, not necessarily. There were, I think they said later on they used, actually, they specifically used older women. But, so the image is sensationalizing the situation. And, tarot cards can do that. They have the, uh, I don't know if I can, ophthalm, this whole navel of the world thing. This is this is a representation of it, which actually, from my understanding, was not inside the temple, it was outside the temple. But this makes sense as the Eight of Swords. Not the swords really so much, but just that she was sequestered. And there were always more than one, and sometimes more than one were used in a given day. And that they only prophesied 9 times a year. And what's interesting here is that they actually, the tripod that she's on is actually quite small as opposed to tall. And, but it does have like there's a mist kind of down here, so that's supposed to represent the gases, so that's a good thing. All right, so what I learned was that they have discovered what resulted in them going into an altered state. So they were tripping, in part, while they were giving their prophecies. And they have narrowed it down to ethylene gas, and I can't remember what drug that we know nowadays is associated with ethylene. But it was really interesting to learn about the last, I don't know if it was 30 years or whatever of research, or even more than that, and how they located the fault, and how they kind of reconstructed the idea of the spring, and how they, theories that they kind of, part of the reason that they couldn't do it constantly was that they would keep the spring capped to capture the gases, between times, in order to have enough gas to have the effect on the women. So it was quite interesting. Even there's that it was really built up around her, so she was there. And she was, if you think of the Eight of Swords, normally we say that the Eight of Swords is self-entrapment, right? You're trapped by your own thoughts. And she's isolated, and there's a city on a cliff in the background. So she's really not too far from the city, but she's isolated from it. And so the women who performed this service, they were isolated, but Delphi was super busy and quite crowded right up to the temple of Apollo, in a section of which they were. They gave their prophecies. And it's almost like they were trapped or held captive actually by other people's thoughts of what they could do, that they became, that something became built up around them based on other people's thoughts and ideas about what they were able to do. Interesting. Of course, all of the training of them, etc., none of that is still none of that is known. There there was a temple of Gaia, not a temple actually. Was there a temple, or was it just that Gaia, in some way, this fissure that had the spring in the gases was initially a worshiping place of Gaia. So there were people who would, and women were associated with this, who were having visions here prior to it becoming a temple of Apollo. And then there was a snake associated with it, and Apollo killed the snake, and that's what made it his temple, and then that all changed. But the women and their practices stayed there. So anyway, all very interesting. But I think the Eight of Swords aspect is simply the fact that, they were tucked away down inside the temple. And I think people did not come to see them in crowd like this. I think it was one at a time type of a thing. But yeah, I can accept this as an Eight of Swords, and it definitely has to do with mind, but it's mind altering. So it has a little different take on it, on the Eight of Swords. And I'll share this too. I'm not sure that I knew this. Like, when I found out about it, I wasn't terribly surprised, but I asked myself, did I know that? The phrase "know thyself" became famous because it was on the Temple of Apollo as you went to see the oracle. It was big and bold there, know thyself. And so for those of us who do divination and tell people that, you have to know yourself in order to in order to absorb the interpretation in a way that's helpful to you, that was emphasized in maybe 2 out of the 3 documentaries I watched. There's one of them I'm not sure that was emphasized, but all right. So the next one, 9 of Swords, is the Wailing Wall, also known as the Western Wall in Jerusalem. So always get out of sorts when it comes to Christian, Jewish, well, a lot of it, actually. That's why I'm having to research all of the cards. I'm not somebody who's been super fascinated by religious things. And when I got Sacred Sites Tarot, I was hoping it more had to do with earth rather than things that, and some of it, of course, does, because as people living on the earth, we become attached to certain locations. But I was thinking it would have less to do with religion, established religions, and more to do, and monuments and stuff like that, and more to do with just really kind of special places around the world. But this has been an education. It's interesting. I still think it's a great deck, and I don't know why it's out of print. Maybe because it does require so much research. Maybe so. I'm probably not the only one who doesn't know about the Dogon village. All right. The Wailing Wall, simply known as the Western Wall, it is believed to date back to the first Temple of Jerusalem, the most sacred building of ancient Jerusalem. And so this is one of the only parts left of that due to, wars, etc. And so that's why they go to that wall. It's the only thing left. It's a section of the Temple Mount, but apparently they're not interested in the rest. They're only interested in this western wall because of the historical religious significance it has for them. So the whole whaling aspect I wasn't getting, because it didn't come out in the documentaries, which were a lot sort of, I'm going to call them semi-touristy things that are on YouTube that are just kind of showing what's going on there, and yeah, not getting very much into the history of how people have used it. But it is essentially an acknowledgement. It's a remnant of of a tragedy. So there is that aspect of it. Also, people go there for prayer, and they so you can see there's these blocks. There's a lot of space between the blocks, and what people do, and this is associated with worry. Usually if you're praying and you come to a place like this to pray, you're going out of your way. You're not praying at your local church or at your, on your beside your bed before you go to bed, or at the table, before you eat. You're going out of the way to make the prayer, that it's something significant. And so you write the prayer on a little piece of paper, so it's a worry. It's a worry on your mind. It's something weighing heavy on your heart. And you put it in these cracks. And so one of the videos showed an up close of these cracks, which you can't see at all from a distance. But they're crammed full of these little prayer papers. And I guess they being whatever religious authority has control of the Western Wall, take the prayers out periodically and store them. They are not to be destroyed. So I can't even imagine from what I saw, with all of those things crammed in there the way they were, how long it actually takes to take them out of the wall, to essentially, quote unquote, clean the wall and take out the prayers so that other people can come and put their prayers in, let alone, how they're stored. But anyway, yeah, so I just get that they come here with their worries and they attach them to the wall as a way of releasing them. So it's almost like a solution to the Nine of Swords, is because you're giving, instead of keeping yourself up at night, you're giving your concerns up to the divine, to whatever you consider to be divine here. So that's the Wailing Wall. So I never really found out why it's called the Wailing Wall, but I assume that it is both grief over the tragedy that occurred here. Again, that it would be a tragedy according to the Jewish faith, and possibly because people come here to pray over things that they are deeply concerned about, and thus tears may be shed. So that makes some sense. So now we have the 10. And I sure didn't even want to research this because it has to do with Nazi Germany. and I'm going to spell it for you, and then I'm going to try to pronounce it the way it seemed to be pronounced in the videos. It's the Castle of Wewelsburg. The W's being pronounced like V's and the E's being pronounced like a long A. So it's Wewelsburg. No, Wewelsburg, Germany. Castle of Wewelsburg. So Heimlich Himmler became attached to this castle, which I think when he found it was pretty much a ruin. And he revitalized it. And it became the headquarters of the SS. And there was a concentration camp nearby to provide the labor for fixing it up, keeping it maintained. And he had this idea of eventually this was going to be only part of a large complex once the Nazis ruled the world. It's like to the Greeks, this was the navel of the world, the center of the world. According to Heimlich Himmler, this was going to be the center of the world. However, as I looked into, again, I think I had to go to Wikipedia for this, but there were hints in some of the videos which were very much fixated on its role in Nazi Germany. There were hints thrown out that it had a dark past, and that's why I went to Wikipedia. It's like, well, what's the dark past? And if Heimlich Himmler had looked into it, though, you know, the egos of these people may not have allowed them to accept that they might have defeat, that this castle was a castle of defeats. This castle had a history of defeats. At least that's what I was seeing in Wikipedia. And it's like, why would you choose this place, you know, for your new world order here when it has proven that it's not going to stand up to that. So that's how I'm going to think of it, as a 10 of Swords. This was, you know, now it's a museum, you know, and I think it's still a youth hostel, and it had in the past been a youth hostel, I think pre-Nazi. But as a castle, as a stronghold, it just kept failing and failing. And so that's how I'm just going to think of it, as the 10 of Swords. With that, is 10 of Swords is usually appears to be a nobleman, likely a king who has been defeated. And so it's like defeat upon defeat upon defeat. It was also, at one point, there were witch trials there. And somebody had said torture. You know, generally witch trials this was like the Inquisition. And so torture was definitely associated with the Inquisition. So yeah, that makes sense as the 10 of Swords. And no problem there. And, you know, and of course there's the Nazi association with prison camps as well. But to me, it's not really about those victims. It's about authorities coming down. This castle does it. If you want to be defeated, hang out here. Call it the center of the world. Call it your stronghold, and you will be defeated. So next, this one baffled me a little bit, partly because I wasn't looking at the card initially. I was just looking, you know, I just had a list that I was going down, and here was, for the Page of Swords, was the Notre Dame. And Notre Dame is dedicated to Mary. So I'm thinking, why isn't this the queen instead of the page? But here we have a gargoyle. And Notre Dame is known for its gargoyles, and so I think that is the crux of it. The gargoyles are pages. So and that's essentially what the Knight of Swords is somebody who's sort of obnoxiously and perhaps not very effectively defends something, is wanting to defend something, is learning to defend. And so that's the function, my understanding. Again, always feel free to add your own knowledge down in the comments. But my understanding in general of gargoyles is that they're like an equal force against demons. And so they have the power to repel the demons who might attack the church. But this is another one that wasn't terribly effective, because there was looting of Notre Dame at times in the past, of being vandalized at times. And so there's that aspect of it. If you want to think of the Page of Swords, particularly in the reverse, as a vandal, then that would be appropriate with this association with Notre Dame. And then there's always the hunchback. And so maybe that it struck me at one point too. It's like, well, maybe they're going with the literary associations with the cathedral, which is the hunchback, and seeing the hunchback as the Page of Swords. Alrighty then, so that's our page. Our knight here, again, it's like, why do we have a Knight Templar? I think this is Mount Tabor. So because I don't know if this mountain, the Knights Templar may have come here. Well, so maybe so I guess I would have to look into that, like if this was a specific place that the Knights Templar were going to. I don't know if that was the case during the Crusades or not. It's Mount Tabor, Galilee, Israel. According to Gospel, this is where the Transfiguration of... Okay, yes, and here they do have the Crusaders. This is where the Transfiguration of Jesus occurred. The Crusaders built a Benedictine monastery here, which was later destroyed by Saladin. So, but there is a temple now, and all I could find, so I wasn't finding the Crusader aspect. Yes, if I had looked this up on Wikipedia, maybe I would have come up with the Crusaders and the Benedictine monastery there. Instead, I had a Christian. He was leading tours of the Holy Land, clearly. And so he was talking about the Transfiguration of Christ, and that's all I could see among the when I searched for this mountain on YouTube. It was just a bunch of stuff about the Transfiguration of Christ, and so that's what I learned about, not about the fact that the Crusaders built a monastery there. In any case, it works as a knight on a lot of different levels. There's the Crusaders that went up there. There's there's Christ, and a couple of apostles went up there with him, where he had an extraordinary experience and was joined by people who had left the earth. And so you had people going climbing to the top. It's a really interesting, I wish I could have found something about the geology of the mountain. It is a really interesting looking mountain. So yeah, and in fact I even searched and didn't find anything, but again I searched on YouTube and didn't find anything. Might have found something if I'd just searched the internet generally. Oh dear, now I'm hearing a mosquito. So if you hear me slapping, you'll understand why. What else was I going to say? So there's been a lot of traveling to the top, and it's not an easy trek. Even now, the road that goes up there is a bunch of really short, steep switchbacks. So a really interesting location. I get the night aspect in terms of people traveling up there, and the fact that it's a religious site. So, and it had been for ages before the transfiguration of Christ. It was believed to have had religious significance, and which is part of the reason why it is currently believed to be the location of the transfiguration of Christ, is because, it's like the thinking is that, if this is the place that they would go, that they would travel to, because it was known to be an important place. So my original objection to the Knights Templar was that, well, the Knights Templar at that point wouldn't have known that it was the place where, and even now it's a theory, of course. And so I didn't know why they would be going there. But again, since there had been, for a long, long time, there had been, it was considered a sacred site. So I get it. All right, next. This was a mysterious one and couldn't find anything terribly authoritative. And I thought maybe with her hair she was being made to look kind of like Medusa, but I think it is just hair. So this is the oak tree in Benevento, Italy. The great oak. Oh no, I'm wrong. Jennifer has it wrong. She's oak obsessed. This is a walnut tree. It's the sacred walnut tree. And see, I didn't know that walnuts were associated with witches. WW. Why not? But they are in Italy. So the walnut tree of Benevento, Italy. Known as the city of witches in ancient times, this place was sacred to the mother goddess and often the site of pagan rituals. So that leaves a lot of interpretation, and like I said, I don't know that I found anything that I would consider quote unquote authoritative. It is said that in this town or area Isis was brought to this area and was worshipped along with Diana and maybe Hecate. It is a place of a crossroads in terms of two rivers joining here and the Appian Way going through it. There were important people. I don't think they were emperors, but there were important people who, again, had set up temples for Isis and temples, I think, for Diana. And this I mostly got from blogs. I didn't find anything about this on YouTube. blogs, and seemed like the blogs were drawing heavily from Wikipedia. And what else was I going to say about this? Flight. Flight. So one of the things, so how to associate it with swords and the Queen of Swords. So this is so interesting because I wouldn't have thought that you would spread unguents on your bodies, like oils, lotions, whatever, unguents is what they called them, in order to fly. It's like you're greased for flight. But that's what it said, is that they were known, the women were known to cover themselves in the unguent, and that would allow them to fly. So they were known for flight. So I don't know if this is the original place where the whole idea of witches flying came from. That definitely was a question in my mind. It's like, oh, so is this where the whole idea of witches on brooms came from? Possibly, I don't know. So instead of a broom, I suppose you could think of a sword, but certainly there's the aspect of air and flying. These witches were reputed to engage in negative things. So a lot of times, I don't usually consider her the hag of the tarot, but there are many people who do think that she just has a rank sort of temperament. The Queen of Swords, I just think of her as having good judgment and good boundaries, but this seems to be taking sort of that tack, so not necessarily witches in a more positive way, because these witches were known or accused of like causing miscarriages and things that particularly had a negative impact on other women. So it's kind of an odd juxtaposition because, Diana, they had the worship of Diana here, and Diana is the protector of pregnant women in childbirth. But there were the witches, and they were the undoers, or were accused of being the undoers of that sort of thing, and also of kind of lesser things that, as I was reading them, struck me as the sort of thing that we would attribute to fae, more pesky mischief-oriented sorts of things, like turning horses loose, that kinds of things. So there's a malevolent aspect to the association with the women of the walnut tree. And there was also, it was said that somehow the women wanted the walnut tree to be noxious. And it's like, why? I mean, it's a walnut tree. What's noxious about walnuts or a walnut tree? So there were a lot of questions in my mind, but I would be inclined that, and the roots of this tree supposedly were in contact with the underworld, and so you have a lot of fae elements here. I love the frog with its hands up like that over here in the corner. But there are other kind of fae characters off to the side here. She's got the owl. She's got some snakes down here. My inclination, I think, Queen of Swords for this card is just going to be the broom riding thing. And, you know, being powerful. You know, she's powerful enough. Looks like there's serpents up in the tree also. So and with her hair being the way it is, there's nothing that I read that had to do with Medusa, but there's a bit of a Medusa aspect going on here. So somebody powerful actually can cross boundaries. So that's an interesting aspect that I hadn't thought about until just now, and that because they were known, they were called something that starts with a J that I didn't make a note of, and that meant door, and it had to do with the fact that they could go under doors. So it was assumed that they could become the wind. Like if there was a violent wind, it was assumed to be one of these women who had turned into a wind. So there's another association with air. But because they could do that, regardless of having your door closed, they could come under the door and get in your house. So that's interesting, because I normally think of the Queen of Swords as boundaries, and these people were actually boundary crossers, according to myth and legend. So there's that. The Queen. The King is Glastonbury. And here we show it being built more like Avalon, I suppose. An attempt to make it look like Avalon. So we've got two important men associated with the tour. Here it says the ruins of Glastonbury, England. Here is where Christian mysticism and Celtic New Paganism meet. It is identified with the legendary island of Avalon. So the two important men, I mean, you could throw in Merlin as well, we'll say three, but more King Arthur. This is supposedly where King Arthur died and is buried. That's the Avalon Association, assuming that this is Avalon. The Tor is actually a remnant of a Christian church, and this is believed to be the place where Joseph of Arimathea, again, my Christian knowledge is shaky. They said, I don't know if it's Arimathea or Arimatha. Supposed to be the uncle of Christ, and after his crucifixion came here, and was this the Holy Grail? Was it the Holy Grail that's supposed to be buried also under the Tor somewhere? Something like that. I think this is not the only card. I can't remember which other one had to do potentially with the Holy Grail, but so yeah, definitely lots of mysticism to go on here, and more than enough men to choose from in terms of being the king, as well as, you know, the remaining tower being very phallic. So so this one was easy. This one was easy and makes sense as the king. So there we have it. Kind of the end of my research on the Sacred Sites Tarot, except that I'm assuming that although I've taken some notes here, they're extremely rough and crossed over and crammed, and, you know, notes going up the side and all kinds of stuff, which is why I come on here to kind of regurgitate some of what I've come across, what I consider the most salient points, or the things that would be good for me to remember. And then I'm going to kind of reverse the process in December, and I'm going to go back and listen over my going through the deck, all of my videos, which I have in a playlist. I'm going to go through all of these again in December and retake the notes in a more organized fashion based on what I have shared here, the sketchy stuff that I have shared here. So not to fixate over a lot of the details, because I think that can be a little bit oppressive after. Of course, I've got huge memory problems, so I'm not going to remember. I want to remember some of it, but I'm not going to remember all of it. So I'm letting go of some of the details that get loaded up in one's head during watching the videos, and I'll be left with what I have shared here, which is kind of sketchy, as my notes on the Sacred Sites Tarot, should I care to refer to them. Should I care to go, all right, now who's this guy supposed to be associated with the tour? You know, and if I feel like I need to look it up in order to drag some additional meaning out of this, then I can do so. So there we go. End of my summer researches, and I can't remember if it even went back into the springtime, on the Sacred Sites Tarot. So I'll be lacking something to research, but that's probably okay. I can have some blank time, some additional time to do journeying, which is proving to be very funky lately. So there we go. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much. I've been really surprised at how many people have kind of come along on the journey and have enjoyed these videos, these lengthy videos. Oh my God, 1 hour and 22 minutes. I think this is the longest one. Anyway, I'm always amazed when people come along for the ride on these videos, because this deck is out of print. But again, write to Los Scarabeo and ask them to reissue this deck, because it is interesting. All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.